This is Viticulture, where we share conversations with makers, growers, thinkers, and doers, folks who cultivate a good life. My name is Chris Missing, and I'm a lawyer turned winemaker in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, and I'm sitting down with great people in wine and other walks of life to hear their stories, learn their lessons, and take their advice on the perfect pairing. Bob Madill has spent a lifetime learning about wine and more than 25 years in the Finger Lakes wine industry. A Canadian by birth, he saw the opportunities that awaited him and made his entrance into the New York wine industry with the founding of Sheldrake Point Winery on Cayuga Lake. He has built businesses, organizations, and influenced a lot of people on his journey. Like the glaciers that marked this land 10,000 years ago, he's made an imprint on the Finger Lakes and helped our region raise its standards along the way. If you like this content, please help us grow by liking this video on YouTube and subscribing to our show on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to visit our website at viticulturepodcast.com. Subscribe to our Substack, where you'll get show notes, transcripts, musings, and exclusive offers. And check us out on all the major social media platforms. And now, here's the show. So our interview today is with another mentor of mine, someone who I think of more as a friend, though. He's helped me during harvest, during crush. He's guided me in decisions in how we run our winery. And he's done a lot to contribute to raising the quality of Finger Lakes wines, of helping us to embrace our heritage, and helping us look to the future. Thanks so much for being with us today, Bob.
Pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Of course. You have a long and storied history in the Finger Lakes. But if we can start with a personal story, I'd appreciate that. You and I attended Provine in Dusseldorf, Germany, a number of years ago. We were all part of an effort to help raise, whether it's the influence, the awareness of what we're doing in New York State generally, in the Finger Lakes in particular. And we had a chance to taste at some great wineries, whether Pinot Noir or Riesling throughout Germany. But the most impactful moments weren't seeing all these producers around the world. It was sitting at a bar with you one night in a hotel and talking about decisions I needed to make for my business. And you said something to me that it has stuck with me. And it's sort of a leadership maxim that didn't even stick with me from the Army, right? It was, Chris, I am not convenient. And it's this idea of not being convenient as a business leader in decisions for your personal life, in decisions in the vineyard, that I think really stuck with me. I'd love for you to elaborate that on that, Bob.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I think what that is standing for is the power of conviction. If you are needful or are driven in a certain direction, pardon me, I have to clear my throat.
That's fine.
You behave. For example, if you think about people who run businesses, you have to be incredibly driven and have a very strict discipline around what needs to be achieved. That doesn't leave a lot of allowance for meandering. Neither does it leave you a lot of allowance for the tolerance of meandering by others. And I think it's a rare person who can feel comfortable enough and has the ability to surround themselves with strong people that feel like-minded. So that comes a lot more naturally as opposed to driving people. The idea of being inconvenient means you're going to ask things of yourself and of others which people are maybe not going to be very happy with, and they may push back. And I found that moving from the high-tech industry in Ontario and its wine industry to a certain extent down to the Finger Lakes, the thing I didn't really allow for, was an extremely different culture.
Mm.
And I didn't allow for my own stridency. And I think I brought a type A personality into an environment which has very little tolerance for the demanding sort of, frankly, egotistical view of having to make achievements.
Mm.
That's sort of, it's an imperative. I mean, the discipline that I had as a business background came from the high-tech industry, and there was no time between decisions other than for action.
Mm.
Because if you didn't move, and you didn't move quickly, and you didn't achieve, you weren't around very long.
Yeah.
As an individual within an organization, and as a company. And I'm not advocating for that behavior, but it was, I think it was a warning note that maybe it's a little bit like the Chinese phrase of being the tall tree.
Mm.
And just better be able to understand some of the reactions of others who sometimes it's not going to be very, very pleasant, let's just say. And I think I was probably reflecting on Sheldrake, where my partner and I were from very different backgrounds, and we made a big mistake in not really addressing that and talking about it.
Mm.
And I think we would have benefited, wouldn't necessarily have led to my prolonged stay at Sheldrake, but nevertheless, I think it would have been a much more comfortable relationship and perhaps a more successful business.
There's a lot to unpack there, Bob. The time preferences of different industries, the time preferences of individuals. Farming takes a long time. Winemaking has to be done at a slow pace. But there's also things that have to happen in a business to move it forward. And so you almost have to have these two separate cultures within sort of our small little agricultural bubble to find success. On top of that, it makes me think it might be beneficial if there was some form of like business partner counseling. We always talk about marriage counseling, but it happens in every business. There's clashes, and when those issues don't get addressed, they fester. It's a fascinating perspective, and I'd love to hear more about your experience that led you to the U.S., that led you to Sheldrake, and what it was like kind of growing up in Canada, getting your toes wet in the industry, and finally jumping in full bore.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've pondered this myself, Chris. What I find is that it's remarkably easy to tell a story about your life and make it sound logical. And there's very little logic to it. And I found myself making changes and transitions, partly in response to circumstances and partly in the directions I want to go. From a very early age, I became engaged with wine. My family drank wine. I could say my parents were they were like born, in an era when drinking was, in a way, is much more prevalent than it is now.
Mm.
And so as a child, we were continually exposed to people imbibing alcohol, but also wine. And I never really had anything to do with it until maybe I was about 12 or 14 or something like that, and only within the family, in a family environment. And realized I liked this stuff, but no particular connection with it. It wasn't until I was about 18. And I still remember very vividly standing in a store, one of the provincial monopoly stores, the SAQ, and holding a bottle of wine, and I'm almost positive it was French, and looking at this label going, I have no idea why I'm buying this wine. But I was buying a bottle of wine for dinner, and I said, that's going to change.
Mm.
So my interest in wine started with just the curiosity of trying to figure it out partly as a consumer, and then sort of going on from there and reading and collecting books and really being fortunate enough that I learned from people who were far better tasters than I was, And then I also sort of got into the culture associated with wine quite a bit through those same people, really. So that means food and wine and so forth. And then in the high-tech business, I was able to travel, and, well, wasn't able to travel, I had to travel.
Yeah.
And, of course, when you're in France, what do? I made appointments to go and see people in Burgundy.
Yeah.
And I remember the first trip, maybe 1977 or thereabouts, and I took some Canadian wine with me from Ontario, Chateau de Charme, and I gave it to one of the producers who was floored. It was Momasan, the guy who ran Momasan, and so I gave him this bottle of wine, and the poor guy went into overdrive trying to find something to give back to me. And then he wrote me a letter later on which said, yes, we agree it was, I don't know, Merlot or Chardonnay. I'm going, well, of course. There was clearly a doubt in his mind that you could do this. And I basically took that as a recognition that we had something of interest wherever we're coming from to share with one another. So I always travel with wine. That really started right there. I've sort of lost I'm not really answering your question anymore. But as I advanced through the various parts of my life, which were mostly sales and marketing, product support for software vendors, producers, I loved wine, and I studied wine, and I tasted wine, and I had friends about wine. I could never figure out how to get into the wine business. But as my interest and almost a professional level grew, even though it was just as an amateur, I recognized I have to learn more about the fundamentals of wine, like where wine came from, how it was made, to develop more insight into maybe why a wine was the way it was. And so eventually this ended up where I started working with small producers in southern Ontario, Niagara region, by moonlighting, because at that time I was with Digital. Digital was going through terribly challenging financial problems, and one of their responses of the company was to reduce the building footprint. So almost literally, we were told to sort of get out of the office because they were going to be shutting buildings, which they did. And they gave us very basic laptops and huge cell phones. If you can remember what it was like in the early days, these things were like bricks.
Yeah.
But the idea was you were mobile, and so away I went. And my personal life was a mess at the time, and I was able, basically as a result, to cut myself loose from Ottawa and essentially travel where I wanted to go. And I ended up doing this sort of second job, or a series of them, down in Niagara, working for various winemakers and wineries, doing everything I could, selling, working in the vineyard, working in the winery, just absolutely everything, to learn as much as I could about the business. And the only thing I couldn't figure out is how to get into it. So eventually, as a result of my curiosity, I was going down to these workshops down in the Finger Lakes that Thomas Hennekling was running. And I got to know Thomas pretty well, and he got to know what I was interested in. And eventually, he was the guy that hooked me up with Greg Sandor, who was a pomology student at Cornell at the time. So this would have been like the early 90s. And eventually, Greg gave me a call because he and his wife, Bernie, had found what subsequently became Sheldrake Point, an old abandoned dairy farm owned by Cy Diamond. And Greg and I put a plan together. It wasn't much of a plan, and I was horrified when I found out that Greg was sharing the plan with other very senior people in the industry. I'm going, my God, these people must think I'm a fool. Because it was very, very rosy projections. Terrible estimation of cost and so forth. But anyway, Greg and I started talking, and through all the technical transitions going on in the industry that I was part of, I eventually left with this Digital to become Compact, because I couldn't get anything done. I'd be traveling to Europe, meeting with these big organizations, and the people managing us really wanted only to sell them laptop computers or desktops. We didn't have laptops, but desktops at the time. And it just became an exercise in frustration, so I left. This opened up, and so I threw my somewhat smallish but enough my nest egg into the mix, and we were able to come up with the financing to buy Sheldrake. And basically my litmus test was, okay, these people are passionate. I was not going to be the general manager, Greg was, and so I was doing what I thought I would be doing, namely having a place where I could go and in my dotage to stumble around a vineyard and have some fun in a more connected fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Never dreaming for a minute I was going to take the project over. But anyway, we got the project up and running in the first week of January of 97.
Mm.
And of course that summer planted some vines. Some of them survived. We didn't do a very good job, but we were amateurs.
Yeah. There's a lot to learn when you enter the industry. I was talking with one of my employees the other day who's going through the Finger Lakes viticulture program. And I said, you see all this? The building, the equipment, the books. I said, I didn't know the single most important thing when I started, which was what I wanted to do and how to make those wines. That is the core basis of what you need, I think, when you start a wine business. Did you know what you wanted to make? Had you kind of tasted a vision of where the future of Sheldrake would go?
No, I'd love to say yes, but not not really. What I did in sort of coming to grips with doing this, basically taking my modest savings and plunging off in this direction, was I'm not a human resources person. I am not someone who knows accounting. I don't know much about viticulture. I mean, I knew a lot about everything, but nothing specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So I was looking for an opportunity to become part of a team, and this was the best opportunity that I could find. I could not afford to go into the business in Ontario. It was too expensive, and I wasn't well enough connected with ownership. And so, and when I say ownership, I mean people who were making these sorts of investments.
Yeah.
But we could put it together on a shoestring and do it at Sheldrake. And from there on in, it was a bit of a voyage of discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And we did not have, I knew a lot about tasting and what I wanted and what I liked and what I didn't like, but I hadn't used my brain to put that together into a strategic or even a tactical plan, other than coming to the ideas, well, we sort of picked the right grapes.
Mm-hmm.
Riesling, Chardonnay. I insisted on Gamay, Cabernet Franc, Pinot. I think initially, I don't think we had Pinot Gris in the ground. I think it was like 5 varieties. And then sort of stumbled off into the wild, Blue Yonder from that point on, really.
The thing I find most interesting, and you hinted this, even by the 90s, getting into the wine industry on an ownership level in Ontario was vastly more expensive than in the Finger Lakes. And I would argue it still is. The history of our regions are somewhat similar, really heavily focused on juice grapes, Labrusca grapes at the onset. They were growing a lot of Concord up in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
The government stepped in Canada and started to pay growers to pull vines out that were native juice grapes and to plant wine grapes. We had the Farm Winery Act, which basically just allowed people to start wineries and grow the grapes they needed for that. But it does seem like the growth of Ontario was parabolic. The buildings, the equipment, there's just so much more money focused up there than there is in the Finger Lakes, which is still hard scrabble in a lot of ways. Putting together what you can and using the barns on your property. What do you think was the biggest impetus for the growth of Ontario wine versus the growth of Finger Lakes wine?
I'd say it's a combination of factors. One would be that the origins of the origins of the industry have many of the traditional European growers, not just from Germany, but also from Algeria through France. And so there was a repository of professionals who were from families that grew grapes, and some of them made wine. People looking for land, looking for opportunity. Canada was welcoming these sorts of immigrants into the country. They were farming people, agricultural people. Some of them were also versed in the business of wine. The Bosque family were very successful business people, growers and wine producers. That's one set of circumstances. The other is just the fact of geography. You have the wine region, Niagara, so closely coupled to Toronto and Canada's largest, or one of Canada's largest cities. And the inevitable sort of movement of tourism down to Niagara Falls.
Mm.
And so there was a bit of a history of people going and buying fruit. And I can remember that as a boy.
Yeah.
Not wine, but fruit. And that transitioned into tourism through wine. And that's another fact. The other important aspect of the change had to do with the economic relationship between Canada and the United States. NAFTA was coming up.
Mm.
At the time before NAFTA, the way wine imports were treated was to tax them and to relieve the tax on Canadian, or certainly on Ontario wine.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this unlevel playing field through taxation, which was about to be leveled. And somebody in the Department of Finance did their sums and basically said these guys are going to be in deep doo-doo if we don't encourage them to get out of the business.
Mm.
And I don't actually recall the politics which allowed this to occur, but what you refer to is called the pullout program, where many growers took the opportunity at X number of $1,000s an acre to remove the types of grapes you discussed, the hybrids, not all of them, of course, but certainly the natives, in getting ready for what was going to become a very difficult transition in the financing and managing of the wine business.
Mm.
So that was coming up, and that really was the impetus for the change in the nature of what was being grown for wine. The grapes being grown for wine, and it was quite profound. Then, on top of this, there was a coterie of people in leadership positions.
Mm.
Carl Kaiser, Paul Bosque, a number of other people who really understood the need to connect with the marketplace and to have a way of signaling the quality of Niagara wines through what became the Vintners Quality Alliance program. And so VQA was used as the vehicle to communicate, basically a marketing vehicle to communicate to Ontario consumers who bought wine the nature, the high quality of the wines coming out of Niagara.
Mm.
And it was enormously successful. The VQA program was very influential in how people behaved at the level of wineries and also in the consumers. And I had people at the time I was doing tastings for amateur winemakers and for American Wine Society in Canada. And these people would come to me and say, anything we can do to help you with the tasting, you just let us know.
Mm.
And I could easily call on half a dozen wineries and they would just send me these samples, and they were very good wines, albeit nascent, not of the same quality as evident today. But it was an immediate recognition of the importance of influencers. We weren't called influencers,
yeah,
but we were reaching out to professionals among the public as well as in the buying, principally the restaurants. Because the other factor you have to integrate into all of this is, in fact, it's a government-run monopoly system, right? So these sorts of marketing signals are extremely important because most of the public was buying their wines through these stores and the LCBO stores. And so this sort of fed on itself because the monopoly recognized it could be successful as well if it properly promoted VQA, which it did.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because there's the sort of analog social influencing you described.
Yeah.
The VQA does more than just provide a stamp of quality approval. It provides a pretty heavy tax incentive for the winery and the
Right.
wine that has that.
That's
wine.
right.
And that has been of some consternation for some producers who are pursuing more of a natural wine approach, which forces their bottles to be more expensive in the region. I think that as someone who was born and raised in California, who learned wine in California, who loves the Finger Lakes, for a lot of Americans, that region in Ontario is a gem of discovery. And we don't have access to a lot of those wines, but it is, when they can travel again, well worth the trip. They'll be blown away.
Yeah, as you alluded to earlier in this conversation, the level of investment is profound, and it's deliberate, and it's encouraged. And yes, it's partly a product of relatively well-off people also having a upscale hobby, but taken very seriously. And a government that recognizes the value of the tourism agriculture resource in that part of the world of Ontario. If you go there, the infrastructure much of what you see, Niagara College, some of the other institutions are essentially funded through programs that recognize the value of agriculture and tourism and all of what is implied in sort of this wine tourism opportunity that is being exploited very successfully and is now so integrated into so many other businesses in the hospitality industry, the hotels, the restaurants. It's very profound.
My wife is French, and so we have had our own sort of cultural clashes at home. Being from somewhere isn't just having been born there. It is a culture, and it dictates oftentimes how you deal with other people.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of not being convenient, is this something that you think is cultural, kind of from a Canadian perspective? Is it something that was shared in the Canadian wine industry that helped it grow so strong, so quick?
I'm not sure. It's a good question. I reflect on the fact that I came out of a discipline of partly as not a very good student. I had to be incredibly disciplined and work very hard to be successful through university. And then going into business, it was the school of hard knocks. And also, I mean, one of the reasons I left the technology industry is I didn't respect some of what I saw. It was abusive. I mean, it wasn't, I know there was misogyny and all the rest of it, but there was men beating up on men, not literally, but verbally, and abusing each other in meetings. And I just felt very poorly about some of what I saw. And yet at the same time, coming down to start a business, I think I was very insensitive to, maybe it was the way I communicated. It wasn't so much what I said as how I said it. I had very little tolerance for people who did not want to move in a good direction. It just wasn't going to work. And I'll be honest with you, to this day, I still feel that frustration here. I really do. I can't imagine being a winemaker and not putting everything you have into a vintage. You've got maybe 30 of these in your life. If you're lucky, that's not much.
No.
And if you make 12 wines or 30 vintages, gosh, you have to be so good every time at bat.
Yeah.
You need to put everything you possibly can. So it makes for an uncomfortable dance, if you can do it nicely. But when I came down here, I looked at the standard of viticulture, and it was not much.
Yeah.
And at one point, I had to organize a trip with a couple of people in our business to take them up to Niagara and show them a few thousand acres of highly disciplined approach to viticulture.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you start here. You make it economically successful at this level. You do it this way. And I think the trip was successful, and they sort of mentally agreed I wasn't a complete ass. But that didn't mean things changed overnight. And so when I say you're not convenient, I was not behaving conveniently. They wanted to go on and just do things the way they were doing them. And change comes hard.
It does.
And I do see evidence of change in the Finger Lakes, but I still see lots of opportunity.
I do too, and I've been fortunate enough to take those trips with you to visit some of the remarkable work they're doing up there and to learn, to talk with winemakers. We've got really good kind of business models to look at. 13th Street Winery, for example, doing some really nice sparkling. What has been the biggest change then? Because there are people, and I think there's an ever kind of increasing number of people striving for excellence in the Finger Lakes. What have you seen that you've said, these handful of producers are on the absolute right track? What techniques, what thoughts of the vineyard, or maybe it's even more. Maybe it's just a holistic thought of their practices.
The transition we're seeing now is pretty multifaceted. Number one, let's call them the original family operations are moving into the second and third generations. These are young people who have traveled a bit. They've certainly learned a lot more. They've had the benefit of being exposed to a family in agriculture. So they've picked up knowledge around equipment, around behaviors. They've probably worked in the tasting rooms. Most of them wouldn't be in it unless there was some, I almost say love of the business, love of family. So that's an important transition. Each generation, I know it was, I don't know about you, but I know at home it was, there was a lot of striving to be me around, strong parents. And I think that's partly the revolution, which is good. It's evolution, but really when you reinvent yourself, which I have done from time to time, you see that in these families, which I think is wonderful. Secondly, we see people such as yourself or, me and others who came in with a different background, but an aspiration. I don't want to say we're corporate, but we're not rooted in the land in the sense of the family owning the farm. But we have very lofty or ambitious goals, I think, because we're aspirational. You taste a wine in Chablis, or you taste a wine at 13th Street, and you sort of say, shoot, why is this different? And do I think it's better? And if I think it's better, why is it better? And you start absorbing all of these ideas, none of which you can implement immediately, but you then have developing goals, developing objectives based on something you believe is realizable. And the frustration for me came in when that shared idea, vision, call it what you will, I couldn't get that across. And that, just as I had to go back to, I think communication is an issue. But that transition is then also with people like someone like Kelby with his own brand, also independently striking out with their own ideas and dropping somewhat large stones into a quiet puddle. It's not so easy to just rest on your laurels here. I think the community there is a community of winemakers that tastes fairly extensively, at least among themselves, to know how they're doing. I wish they'd taste a little bit more broadly and with more resonance, but it's happening. We're still struggling in the area of viticulture, I think, though, as you say, it's improving. We have not had the viticulture, the FLCC around for all that long, really. And it's certainly having an impact because those students are going out, and many of them are finding jobs in our industry here. So those are changes. A huge change has been the recognition of the strength of the region, albeit sometimes in rather paternalistic language by some of the writers. But
explain that.
Well, which part of that?
Are you kind of hinting at the idea of, we've come so far? What do you mean when you say paternalistic?
Well, I still think that in certain quarters, let's take one aspect, for example, which is there, would you ask yourself, I have asked this question, and I ask you, do you think many observers of our industry who have some knowledge of the Finger Lakes really think we make wines that are going to have longevity?
I think that there are a lot of people who just want to get their wine sold so they can pay the bills and buy their fruit the next harvest. I don't know that they're making their wines thinking about whether or not their children will be enjoying them.
And I'm in complete agreement that there is a financial imperative in running a winery, and particularly these days, everybody's been changing like mad. And I think what is interesting is if you reflect on the basic way, the basic location that we are in, a cool climate, a moderated cool climate, means inevitably whites and reds tend to be fresh.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to have lower alcohol. They tend to have lower pHs. They tend to be wines that are naturally going to age and express themselves better over time. Not for every wine, but for many of them. And when you go back and you as you have, I know, tasted through either your cellar or somebody else's, and you hit something like a 90, say a 90, well, that's too old, certainly a 90, perhaps a 99, but certainly a 2002, 2004, those are some incredibly resonant wines.
They are. Still
alive today. And so they may not have been made intentionally that way, but the very fact of where the grapes are grown and the location that they're grown in lends them to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wish more of our colleagues that observe our industry, the wine enthusiasts, the Molesworth and so forth, would have the patience to taste back, or maybe turn that around, are given the opportunity or encouraged to have the opportunity to taste some of these older wines.
I agree with you. One of the things you've encouraged me from just about the beginning was to ensure that we really stacked our library, and not with a case of this or a case of that, 15 cases if you can, a pallet if you can. And I took that to heart. We've got a pallet of our 12 dry Riesling.
Well, that's a lot. That's a real vote in the future.
We have our 12 Meritage available for tasting right now. I made sparkling wine in 2017 with an idea that my son would have 20 cases to disgorge on his 21st birthday. I think that it is not for a lack of want that people here want to be able to show their wines a decade, 2 or 3 in the future. I do think it's largely that economic problem, but it has to be coupled with this idea that the benefit of holding some of these wines back so people can see where our wines will go has more than just an economic benefit. There is a legacy. There is almost I use this word, but there is a spiritual component to it. It's connecting us with the past, with either people who have passed or a different time in our lives. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I mean, climate-wise, we are handed a gift. We can pick Riesling in especially some years where there's 9 TA and 11% alcohol and, still 15 grams of residual sugar, like the magic recipe for aging a good off-dry Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll come. And I do wish we had deeper libraries all around to taste. It's been one of the great things that you've been able to show me is some of these older wines from Ontario. I know we've had everything from older Rieslings and Chardonnays to some really cool older hybrid grapes. Marichal Foch, for one.
Baco Noir.
And we've gone through this. I think we are coming out of it finally. But it feels like we spent so long trying to grow vinifera or European-based grapes in the Finger Lakes and make wines that were getting talked about in great reviews. And if you were making a hybrid grape varietal, it was, second tier, or you might not even talk about it. The magazines don't want to review these, but they can be some really compelling wines in the right hands. And their chemistry means they can live a really long time. Have you seen that across the Finger Lakes, this idea that we are coming out of the shadow with some of the higher quality and better grown hybrids and ready to say, I'm perfectly proud to be making a Saval Blanc or a Baco or Foch or you name it?
I think there's some evidence that it's being taken more seriously. But I think people are very concerned with ensuring that the message around the more commonly accepted Riesling, Chardonnays, Cabernet Francs is being heard and accepted. I mean, they're going to, many people, not many, but quite a few have bet the bank on Riesling, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So they really want a Riesling message coming out of all of the marketing organizations or the agencies that represent and support the industry. It is ironic, and it's still a lot of fun. One of our colleagues, Paul Brady, was up. He's opening up a store in Poughkeepsie, and he was up with his team and asked me to join them for dinner and bring, if I would, an older Ontario wine. And I think it was a 93 Baco Noir. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Just fabulous wine. And it's funny because I'm sure I was there and helped bottle that wine up at Vineland. And I was trying to remember Baco, and I think, well, I know what we would do with Baco. We would often bottle it at the time we need to sell it. So we would haul this huge container up the hill with Eddie had this big old blue truck and the transmission, and you could just smell the burning as this thing lumbered up the hill, and we'd bottle it up and literally start selling it that afternoon or the next morning, because we had to have Baco, right? That was it. That was why some people came to the winery. And so I can haul out a bottle of that every once in a while and marvel at how good it is. And I know I'm enjoying it more than I did then, because I think the acid is knitted together and the soundness of the wine is remarkable. And yeah, that's a little bit of je ne sais quoi in there. And that was part of Eddie's signature. Eddie Gorinskas was the guy I worked with. And I do see sort of back to the future elements of this in the Finger Lakes, but not in a profound fashion just yet. But I wouldn't be surprised that we are able to give ourselves more permission to do this with more acceptance in the marketplace than in the past. And I'm also going to credit some of our colleagues in places like the Hudson.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're doing some wonderful, wonderful job, like Steve Castles, with these old varieties and bringing them out again. And I think it's wonderful. And I think it just makes so much sense. They grow better, right? They're just built better for our local conditions. So you have a better economic chance in the vineyard, and your cost of production is going to be less, and the quality is going to be right up there.
It is. I think it was the 19 vintage. I opened up a bottle of 2004 Clinton Vineyards Seyval Blanc for our cellar, and Hudson Chatham.
Oh yes, of course.
The Baco that has been made there is just beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, kind of talking about varietals, among the many, many hats you've worn, Bob, was kind of one of the original founding group for the Finger Lakes Wine Alliance. You've served as chair. You've been involved for years. It is focused on spreading the word of Riesling in the Finger Lakes and beyond. Let's talk about Riesling. Does it grow well here? Yes. Can we make sparkling, still, and dessert wine from it? Yes. Does the consumer want to drink Riesling? That's the question.
It's an interesting. I'm going to give you I hope it's not too much of a complicated answer. Well, first, thank goodness that we got together and agreed on one thing to spread the message of the region. So there's a lot of weight on the shoulders of Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
Just as one might imagine that in Australia, not Australia, but in New Zealand, there was a lot of shoulders on the weight of Sauvignon Blanc. Now also a little bit of Pinot, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a benefit to have at least something that people accept. Now, about your point, there may not be much of a market for Riesling in comparison to Chardonnay. It's a fraction of the size, and Chardonnay is growing as a type of wine that people enjoy. Americans are drinking more, not less, every single year. And so Riesling is a small fraction of that, but it is there. And the challenge we face isn't try to answer the question, shouldn't all people drink Riesling? It's like, no, I need to find the people that want to drink my Riesling. And so I think it's up to the Riesling producer to find the market. It's there. It's small, but it is certainly there. And it's what's carrying the reputation of the region right now. So you would think that if people exerted the energy to find their customers rather than waiting for them to walk through the door, they might have more success and feel less alarmed, and have an opportunity to then engage with them about all the other things that they do so well, whether that's Chardonnay or Cabernet Franc or what have you. So I base my that general sort of thought process on looking at business numbers, sales numbers from Wine Business Monthly. And since we know roughly what the wine drinking portion of the public is, we know roughly how much Riesling is sold in the United States, we can make a projection about the share of Riesling that we have in the Finger Lakes of our national market.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that. And it's not big, but it is measurable and it is there. So I'm absolutely convinced that Riesling can be successful. I don't think it's going to do it by itself, but we needed that very clear, committed, demonstrable proof point so that you and I, when we travel now, literally all over the world, people will know about Finger Lakes Riesling. It doesn't matter where you are.
Yeah.
And that message has been successful. That hasn't translated into immediate markets, but it's certainly given us the opportunity. It's the marketing door opener, right? That then the winery has to walk through.
Mm-hmm.
And the Finger Lakes Wine Alliance was built to carry out this mission of raising the visibility within, well, arguably within New York State, but certainly also within the U.S. Have we executed that as well as we might? No, we haven't, but we've achieved an awful lot. And I think every day that I think about the Finger Lakes Wine Alliance, I think, thank goodness we established that way back 15 years ago and have sort of progressively, made incremental movements generally in the right direction. But it's been a slower journey than I would have than I imagined when we started.
I do think it's done amazing work. You are right that, for instance, I was in France visiting my wife's family, and I go to one of my favorite small producers in a tiny region. The region's called Gaillac and Domaine Plageau. Fantastic wines. They're using, all of these different indigenous varietals that are vinifera that we don't hear about. Grapes like Bracol and Prunellar.
Right.
And I'm talking with the son of the owner who I had originally sort of built a relationship with. And he says, "Oh, Finger Lakes, yeah. Bloomer Creek." Because he's a natural wine producer.
Oh, he may have.
All the stuff
right.
that he did an event in Canada with the folks from Bloomer Creek. But what he knew was your tiny region in France, the Finger Lakes is Riesling. So that message has reached, all the corners of the wine world. Thank you for your efforts there. On that, I do think the Chardonnays that we can produce, and I'm not saying every Chardonnay in the Finger Lakes is amazing, but when people put their minds to it, I also do believe that we are one of the most compelling Chardonnay producing regions in the world. I think we both have a love of Chardonnay. Do you think that we are on the same trajectory with Chardonnay in the Finger Lakes as we have been with Riesling?
No, not yet. And I think it's going to be a slow evolution, and I think that has largely to do with the notion that, well, there's already a lot of Chardonnay. Who needs to bother? It's what are we going to be doing? Another glass of Chardonnay? So yeah, that's about right. Another glass of Chardonnay. Chardonnay is the workhorse in the drinking public. It's sure Pinot Gris, but if you look at the sales number, Pinot Gris isn't even close to Chardonnay.
Yeah.
Not even vaguely close. Chardonnay is virtually one every 4 or 5 bottles that people are consuming. It's huge.
Yeah.
20 to 25% of all the wine. Chardonnay. It's not all from the U.S. by any means. But I do think it's an opportunity, and it's one that our friends across the border in Ontario are certainly taking a run at. Chardonnay in Canada, at least in Niagara, for sure. And I see no reason why we shouldn't be concentrating on, or at least building out on the shoulders of Riesling, other varieties to support the whole regional portfolio.
Yep. And when it comes to red, we've largely hung our hat on Cabernet Franc. It's interesting to me, Cabernet Franc, if you're talking about Chinon, will have these strong bell pepper methoxypyrazines, vegetal at times. That can be a function of a number of things, whether how it's grown, when it's picked. What I find interesting is in the Finger Lakes, we have less of that, but it's not uniform. It is a vintage by vintage flavor profile that changes depending on what the weather was like that summer. So let's talk about Cab Franc, and then let's talk about the reds where you think we have opportunity that we're missing.
I love Cabernet Franc. It's not my top varietal, but it's certainly one of my top varietals, and I think it does well on the region on its own terms. And by that I mean we are a cold climate, as I said earlier, modified cold climate region, so we get fresh wines, more red and blue fruited. These are clearly not, big warm region reds, whether from Australia, California, Chile, whatever it might be. So they belong on the table. They're fresh, lighter in alcohol. They're wonderful. Great opportunity. You mentioned Provine earlier, and I would use Provine as a way to become educated on what Cabernet Franc was like and other varietals. But I'd go to the booth where the Loire was, where you could stand at a booth and a self-service, multi-leveled kiosk, basically, and within arm's reach, taste a dozen Cab Francs. And I'd spend 30 or 40 minutes there, much to Susan Spence's annoyance, because I was there to represent the region and work the New York booth. She got furious with me. Anyway, but I could learn what Cabernet Franc was like, because I did this 2 or 3 times, and you could taste 30 or 40 wines. It was magnificent. And I said, oh, man, these things just aren't ripe. I mean, they had a different signature.
Yeah.
And our Cabernet Francs aren't like Loire Cabernet Francs, and thank goodness.
Yeah.
And nor are they like the Bordeaux version of the Bordeaux varieties. They've got some of the same DNA. So I think Cabernet Franc has a place, which is an important place. I don't think it's the end of the conversation about reds by any means, but I think it's an important one. And I'm particularly excited by I think it's mostly the younger producers, but, correct me if I'm wrong, who are experimenting with unoaked Cabernet Franc. I think it's absolutely fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many of the examples that I've tasted have been that crunchy red fruited thing that I look for in Beaujolais, which I love so much. And I think this is just great. I'm not discounting traditionally made, barrel conditioned Cab Franc. I had one last night for dinner. 2015 Rhine William, which I think I bought when they opened, and it was fabulous wine. It was not over oaked, but it was dense. It was expressive, had beautiful texture. I had a lamb loin chop, which I'd never made before, and it was perfect pairing, just fabulous. And I thought, who knew? I sort of opened up this bottle thinking, well, we'll see what this is about. And then, God, this is really good. So I'm completely in agreement that Cabernet Franc can go in that direction. But also, I mean, I was asked this question many, many, many years ago, and I said, I hope Cabernet Franc from the Finger Lakes can be the honest glass of red wine at the dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
Just a nice glass of wine. Let's not worry about making it opus or something of that nature. Let's just have a nice glass of wine that people can afford to drink and enjoy without overcomplicating it. And I still think that's the place for Cabernet Franc.
I think that is. In so many ways, the Finger Lakes is that sort of everyday place. It's down to earth. There is an authenticity to the people and to the wines. And sometimes that authenticity is for better or for worse. And it's interesting because the world of wine is a very big pond, and we are a small fish. But I have fully embraced being that small fish.
Yeah, I'd rather be in the Finger Lakes than most any other place right now, frankly.
Yeah,
for a variety of reasons. But it's an absolute superb place to live, to raise a family.
Yep.
I couldn't when I first came down here because I just couldn't believe it. I was just blown away. Because if you go to anywhere in Ontario where there's people, it's like everybody wants the same thing: access to water, place to get away. And you come down here, it's like, holy Toledo, you can buy a farm down here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we paid about $350,000 for Sheldrake, including 200 feet of waterfront, and it's like pinch me.
Yeah.
150 acres and this for that price. That wasn't even vaguely possible in Niagara at that time.
It was 97, but it still isn't out of reach today.
No, it's not.
And we've seen people who've done quite well in California, California winemaking, buying vineyards in the Finger Lakes. Two immediately come to mind. I'm sure there's more, but Red Tail Ridge and Nova and Brian Catamonte's project, Trestle 31.
Hobbs.
And Paul Hobbs. I
Hobbs.
forgot that one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm not looking for a land rush. I'm just thinking, as you are, is like the back of my mind is, real estate is still relatively affordable here. But I want to turn back to your original question about red grapes for the region, because you're like the rest of us. I mean, everybody's pondering this. Is there a signature? I'm not sure there is one, but we have an opportunity. We can look at what you mentioned Nancy Ireland, what she's doing with things like Teroldigo, and maybe there's a future for that. I don't have enough experience with it yet.
I've worked with Lemberger. I've worked with Merlot in the Finger Lakes. I've worked with a lot of different hybrids. I like Lemberger. I think that you've been a proponent for Gamay in the Finger Lakes for a long time. Have you tasted Gamays that are compelling that would convince you we need to plant more of it down here?
Well, I've had some good Gamays from New York, one of which was from the Hudson, which was very good, and a couple from here which are showing promise. But unfortunately, when I came down here and we started Sheldrake, I purchased the Gamay roots material from Euro nurseries, and I don't think they gave us the right stuff. If you go and look at Sheldrake's growing, their berries are rather large, susceptible to breakdown. I mean, it's going quite well now because Gamay has become popular, particularly in New York City. So now the wines are being sold quite successfully. But I look to Ontario as a means by which I gauge Gamay, and I'm trying to think. I know there's some out west and California and here and there. Oh, Michigan. Yeah, Shadow Ground Traverse has got very good Gamay, and I think Mari maybe have planted some. But principally, my benchmark is Ontario and Niagara.
Yeah. Speaking of Michigan, Sean O'Keefe has been out here before. Great storied family history in the region. They often get compared to the Finger Lakes. They grow a lot of Riesling. They make it's cooler climate. What do you think about that comparison? When you taste the wines, and we've both done them together, do you find a common thread, or do you say this is a totally different place?
Sometimes it seems common, and sometimes completely not the same. And I think it's vintage dependent, as well as producer dependent. They're also, I think, really a lot colder, an awful lot colder, and they get some pretty tough winters there, and we'll skate by.
The great irony is those Great Lakes will freeze over, or they did in 14, and Seneca Lake didn't. And that provided the buffer of just those extra degrees that ensured our vineyards didn't die off or require replanting.
Sometimes, I've tasted out there some Pinot, which I thought was pretty impressive, and it seems more of a struggle here.
It does. It does.
I don't know exactly why. There must be something about their growing conditions in some vintages which are superior.
The producer that I think will make a go of it and show the world what Finger Lakes Pinot can be will be Johannes Reinhardt at Chemeter. I don't think he's released it yet, but that is the one that I'm keeping an eye out on.
Yeah, I haven't tasted it. Yeah. I'm curious as heck.
Me too.
see what he can do, because I agree with you. He's a very conscientious man.
Yep. Of the different headwinds that are out there, you and I talk a lot about culture, the world, where it's going. I think the Finger Lakes is in a good place with regards to what changes in temperature can be with climate change. We talk, and we have over the years talked a lot about what AI might mean for the human race. Recently, we had a conversation where it seemed like that thought had been resparked in you. Where do you think we're going with technology? And juxtaposing that to what we do in the wine industry, which is very human driven. It's manual. We're in the vineyards. We're physically making wine. And we really don't have the funds to invest in the sort of kind of wine cellar architecture it would take to become fully automated. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'll be honest, my principal concerns about AI have more to do with what's happening with facial recognition stuff and the application of that for social law enforcement or social mores enforcement and that sort of thing. And not principally in the United States, though there is some applications that local police forces have been adopting, not very successfully from what I can see. I mean, most of the, I think about AI as applied to vineyards, let's say, with this thought, and that is that our conditions are so variable here, both from the point of view of land and how we experience a vintage. And one of the things that's pretty difficult for people to understand is that you could be, let's say, at the bottom of, down by Watkins Glen or at the top of Cayuga or Cayuga and have a very different idea of what summer was like.
Yeah.
And it's because of your rainfall patterns are going to be different. Maybe not so much the temperatures, but certainly the winds and the rainfall. And we both know that rain is almost everything.
Yeah.
And so one thing we've got is variability. So we're not exactly in a situation where, well, it's more difficult for me to imagine, say, GPS units connected to harvesters or viticulture machinery and being used to make predetermined or algorithmic decisions about some of the practices. It's easy for me to understand how a farmer might be better informed about what's happening in the vineyard by virtue of more sensors, temperature, humidity, that sort of thing. Better sense of what the growing season really is like. I mean, for example, one of the confounding aspects of viticulture, at least as I've experienced here, is it's really difficult to understand what the size of your crop is. I mean, look at 17.
Yeah.
What a surprise. Everybody's going, where did these grapes come from? I'm going, well, they were there all year.
Getting accurate cluster counts that year was nearly impossible. 13 and 17 were these just high peaks on the bell curve of fruit loads.
Unbelievable. People got surprised.
Yeah. Huge.
And yet, we're not stupid.
No.
It just means our technology in doing this thing is very poor. It's very inadequate. Or maybe a better way of saying it is we don't understand the variability that's there.
Yeah. So kind of breaking that down 2 points. In imagining a future where these things could be automated, because arguably with enough data points and enough directions, automation will get to a point where these things will be taken care of for us. How important do you think the human element of the human being doing this work is for the final product? Is there something that is beyond just the liquid in a bottle that requires us knowing that someone made decisions along the way and was physically involved with this? Is wine a unique product, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, I think for me, wine is incredibly connected to place. And place invites a curiosity about the history of the place. And you explore that curiosity literally in terms of its geology and the geomorphology and so forth, as well as the culture. And the experience of weather, the weather of the region over some period of time. And most of it, when we talk about a vintage, most of what we're saying to ourselves is this is what the season looked like over this year, and this is how I, as a grower, a farmer, cultivated my grapes in that year. And these are the circumstances that give rise to my ability to predict how to change my behavior based on my previous understandings. And so when I think about winemaking, I really think of it from the basis of the growing of the grapes and the experience of the seasons and your repertoire of knowledge. I mean, literally, when I start thinking about my time in the Finger Lakes, I think of 97, 98, 99. I can literally call up what I think the vintages were like up to about 2007, 2008, when it starts to become a bit foggy. But all those early vintages are imprinted in my mind quite clearly. And the grower that has the ability to do that, have that experience of one vintage and one place over 20 years, I think brings something to the table, especially that is a grower, producer in the European sense, and a person who enjoys and is knowledgeable about what wine is.
Yeah.
So if you bring that right from its elements of what happens in the seasonal behavior of a plant, through to a grape cluster, through to what happens in the winery, to the bottle, and you do that for 15 or 20 years in one place, you've got an awful lot of experience. I think it's going to be, yes, maybe you could replicate it in some way, but is it going to be worth the time and the money? And is somebody going to put a couple $100 million into it? I doubt it.
Yeah.
And to me, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was this notion that when you open up an older bottle of wine, you're brought back to face a bit of history.
Yeah.
It's living liquid history in a bottle.
It is.
And when I open up a bottle of an older wine, I say, okay, where was I? What was I doing? Or who were these people?
Yeah.
And what were they doing? And what was their life like in 47, let's say?
Yeah.
The year I was born. I said, God, can you imagine? Excuse me. France, let's say, in 1947, still in the throes of food shortages and recovering from the war. And where did they get their supplies from? How could they have made this wine? Who picked the grapes? Well, old women, children, old men.
Yeah. That is striking. And for me, it is going to old California wines, which you can still find relatively accessibly on like WineBid. I've had customers who've become friends pour 53 Chateau Margaux and trying some of the Madeiras that you can still find from like 1898
Yep,
out
that's
there.
right. Yeah.
It connects you with history. And that's why, to me, wine isn't just a product. It is a picture of really the human spirit. So.
Yeah, no, I see it similarly. And that's why really in my mind, I push back against this idea of automation. It's a very deterministic human endeavor.
Yep. With that said, wine is a big part of your life. I consider it something that helps elevate our lives. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the good life is. Areas where you realize you may fail to live your best life, but areas where you think, this is what it's all about.
Well, part of reflecting on that, I think, is to acknowledge how privileged one is.
Mm.
And some people's lives right now aren't very good at all.
No.
And so I feel very privileged to be, frankly, a white Anglo-Saxon male and who's in a very privileged position. And I recognize and acknowledge it. I don't feel guilty about it, but that is certainly true. And I think in answering your question, I think in any circumstance of your life or in any time in your life, you have to be aware of how much is given to you and how much is how much you owe back. And I made some decisions foolishly and some decisions not so foolishly. I think it's wise to try to carry in as much as you possibly can a recognition of being grateful for what you have in whatever your circumstances might be. And mine have been relatively well off. There's times and places where that it's not real, that there may be some element of your life which just is a little bit too perfect, too comfortable, too enjoyable. I mean, frankly, my time living at Sheldrake on the lake, I knew would pass. It was so beautiful. It was so enjoyable. And the struggle is just to enjoy, just be calm and enjoy what you can at the time you have it. And I think I'll be looking back at my large part of my life in the Finger Lakes with that same lens. I rather hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, again, coming out of the high-tech industry where you barely had time to breathe and run around, you were so busy, just running around doing things. And when I was able to come off of that, I made deliberately decided where best I could to stop. That's why when I traveled, I made a point spending, as you and I did when we went down to the R Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Same deal. Or when we were, Ratzenberger.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that trip enormously.
Definitely.
You know, I remember that much more than Provine, frankly. Well, except I remember meeting Kata Matry Nova there.
Yep.
Which was very interesting. So what's a good life? I mean, hopefully it's a well-balanced life where you have room for many different things in it, many different colors. Maybe wine has been a bit too much of a preoccupation. It's like anybody else with a stamp collector. If all they do is talk about stamps, it's pretty bloody boring.
It is. I think you're right, though. I think these are certainly ingredients: gratitude, responsibility. And for me, it is this notion of, in all moments, recognizing that this too shall pass. So in those really difficult moments,
yep.
And like you said, in those moments that almost seem too perfect, I'm a little older than a lot of my friends who had kids. I have a 4-year-old and she'll be 7 months old. And I think the benefit of being older is I recognize that face, when I look at my child, is going to change. And I want to make sure I remember that. And that forces us to be much more in the moment. I think that, the whole concept of this project is helping us recognize what will help us live our best lives. And I think being in the moment is something that, whether we have a bottle of wine on the table or not, is something that will help us in those good times and in those bad times.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it'd probably be a good point to taste some wines.
Sure, sounds good.
I grabbed one that you've actually helped out on. Oh, this was the Riesling.
Okay.
I grabbed the wrong bottle, but that's all right. We're tasting some sparkling.
Cool.
You helped out on this too, though. This is our 2016 Sparkling Riesling.
Cool. Good. An interesting vintage.
It is. Not one that a lot of people thought about for sparkling right away.
No, that's right. Hot and dry.
Yep. One of the things I noticed where a lot of the fruit for this wine came from, the Cashon Glen vineyard, it's very shallow soils.
Mm-hmm.
And because it didn't have that excess of water, the vines were a little stressed. And we didn't get an excess of sugar production or alcohol in the final wine. So this one was aged in neutral oak for a year before it was bottled with chapitalizing and for its bottle fermentation.
Cool. Great.
Let's give you a little bit. Why don't you talk a little bit about sparkling wine in the Finger Lakes, Bob? What you think the future of it is, what you see that's being produced now?
Well, I think we have just enormous potential with sparkling wine, and it's. I know it's been a frustration to some people over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, because the recognition that they thought when you produce sparkling wine, you have to be passionate, right? Because of all the steps you go through, particularly as you have done it with bottle conditioning. And I remember speaking to Fred Frank many years ago, and he was sort of reflecting to himself that he had expected their volume of arguably very good sparkling wine to grow much faster than what he anticipated. And it was sort of like he hit this wall that he couldn't get past a certain number of cases. And that sort of was, I think, disappointing to him, because he was a person that said, no, this is good. This merits more attention. And it wasn't coming. So I see this being of great potential. And I think there are more people investing in it. You have made some very interesting wines, but using a different technique, which I've been telling people about, because I think it's so clever, because you have adopted technology and used a sort of an old method in a way, but in a modern way, in a modern sense, which I think is it's not just clever, it's giving wonderfully interesting results. Because you can talk about the technique later on, but makes me a great fan of some of these wines, because they have a character which is more accessible, it's riper, it expresses the fruit very clearly, and gives you an economic return. So you sort of have the best of all possible worlds. But I'm very bullish on sparkling wine in the Finger Lakes.
I am too. And that's why I've put a lot of effort into exploring these different approaches. I don't know if I've ever told you the background of where I came up with it. So, the modern method is what I call it. And it's basically recognizing our natural chemistry here in the Finger Lakes of phenological ripeness, but still higher acids. And I just contemplated myself, well, if the big issue is you pick at 22 bricks, and if you ferment that dry and then capitalize, you're going to end up with alcohol that's too high for your sparkling.
Right. Yep.
But everything else is exactly where we want it to be. Why don't we just stop that fermentation at 24 bricks? So for those not involved in sparkling wine, 24, or not 24 bricks, but 24 grams of sugar per liter.
Right.
That is an important number, because for every 4 grams of fermented sugar, you get 1 bar of pressure. And so you want to get up to 6 bars of pressure for the bottle. And I thought to myself, well, why don't we try filtering at 24 grams per liter and let the grape's natural sugar do its bottle fermentation?
Mm-hmm.
In our first vintage doing this, I didn't have the crossflow yet. So Daniel and I basically went through hours and hours of headaches with pad filters.
Right. It was terrible.
To get 100 gallons
Yep.
of wine. It worked. It was a long process, and it wasn't sustainable. And so the crossflow had come for our still wine production, but it did not take long for me to think, oh my gosh, this is what this is going to be its best use for me. And so we've done that with everything from white Merlot to Gewurz to Cabernet Franc Rosé.
Mm-hmm.
It is a decision based on the wine whether or not we do traditional. This was a traditional.
This is a traditional ferment. Okay.
Traditional method, with the chaptalization, or whether we explore these, as you mentioned, riper styles, riper approaches with varietals people don't typically do these sorts of wines with.
Mm-hmm.
So the sparkling Gewürztraminer, I think, to me, has proven this is the best use for this varietal in my winery. Gewürztraminer is a grape I love, but it doesn't sell real well. It's a different profile. But I have done now traditional method and this modern method with Gewurz, and every time, and you tasted the 19 recently.
Spectacular.
Every time, the modern method shows that wine what it should be.
Yeah, it gives you a beautiful expression of the fruit.
Yep.
It's just so compelling.
It is. So yeah, this wine, it's a little different approach. We make a wine called Feu de Chêne, which just basically means aged in oak. This oak is older oak. There was at least 4 vintages of generally Chardonnay through the barrels. But the key for me was less about oak. It's more about this maximizing of the lees contact.
Mm-hmm.
So we give it the time. And when we pulled out the 16 vintage for Feu de Chêne, took a look at the alcohol, tasted it, and we decided in the cellar we had to peel some off to make this sparkling wine. So you get some of those brioche notes, and it just offers a totally different window into what Finger Lakes Riesling and then sparkling Riesling can be.
And how long was this on the lees, Chris?
In the barrel or in the...
combined.
So this was in barrel for 1 year,
Mm-hmm.
in contact with gross lees.
Right.
And then it was in the bottle for about 3 years before
okay.
disgorgement.
Cool.
This also did not receive any sulfur in the dosage, though it did get a small dosage.
I love the way this wine fills the mouth. Beautiful mousse. It just gives you the sense of the aging on the lees, but as an indirect consequence of that, and just this sort of richness and umami-like character that comes with that.
Yeah.
Very, very successful. And, it's quite surprising because of the vintage. The vintage, as you said, is not one that you would think of making a sparkling wine for. But this is the confounding part of the Finger Lakes where you can have a vintage which should be only a red wine vintage. And it turns out we make really good white wines, or white wines that it should be, and it's the other way around. So one of the things I was able to do with my wine library at Sheldrake was when we had someone come in that was interesting, or a group of people typically. I'd pick a vintage like 2005 and have a Riesling and a Cabernet Franc.
Yeah.
Then I would pick a vintage like 2003 and have a Riesling and a Cabernet Franc.
Yeah.
Then I would serve them to them blind. 2 Rieslings, 2 Cab Francs, and then I'd show them what they were dealing with. It just blew their minds.
I've been over, and this was sort of in your transition period out, but I was always impressed. You walk into Sheldrake, and in the tasting room, there's always some library wines that are open, and you have a chance to taste a wine that might not be for sale, but it is that window into the past.
Yeah, that was an idea we borrowed from, someone out in California, in Napa, and they were doing the same thing because they were pre-selling, in fact, one of their big red wines this way. It's delicious.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So where do you see the future, Bob, for yourself and for our region?
I don't know. We're all on a journey. I'm on mine. I don't know what it is, but it's funny. Lorraine Hems, who you know, instructor at RIT, I go and I speak to her class, or she's invited me in the last 5 years or so to speak to her class. And inevitably, this idea of life's journey comes up because they're all young people.
Yeah.
So I try and explain to them that I look back on my life and I said, yeah, it's tempting to make it a logical chronology, but it's not. But I've done this, and it's not like I'm boasting. I'm simply saying I've made these transitions. And some of them are deliberate. Someone was like, no, actually, Madill, you're fired. There's no transition going on here. You're out. When I was vice president of a high-tech company and I got fired, and going, wow, that wasn't very nice. It was very, very unnice. But, there's something to tell you that something's coming up.
Yeah.
So I look upon my time right where I am now in Geneva as sort of in between transitions. And I really... I try to do some other things like, various projects, or working with a cooperage, which I really enjoy, Bossuet, because it connects me back into the wine industry in a way that it draws my interest in, and I don't know very much about. And I've got a few other things that I'm doing, but I really don't know. I mean, I'm sort of, I guess I'm semi-retired, but I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. I get too many things to do, and my cat's not going to let me retire, so that's for damn sure.
Named Chardonnay, by the way.
Chardonnay, that's right. So I'm not sure. I've had in this back of my mind, I'm going to move back to Canada. But I had a friend ask me, basically say, why? And I said, well, it's the health program. And he said, well, maybe that's going to change. And I thought, she may be right.
Yeah.
Things may change here in the U.S. I don't know. I still feel I've always liked, when I was in business, I really got to know a large part of the U.S. by trying to do business here. And we did some very good business in the U.S., and I liked doing business here because I could always work out a deal. Yeah. And in Canada, it was so frustrating because inevitably the provincial government would come in, and it just became a mess. But down here, I could do a deal, and a good one, like a fair one. That was always important to me, that the customer got every ounce of value that we could offer, and we got money back.
Yep. But
it was fairly earned, and that's good business. And I liked doing business in the States for that reason. So I like it here. I mean, I'm like everybody else who's looks at what's going on and just hopes for better things in the future for everybody. And not just speaking of the pandemic, but economically, socially, and so forth. And I think I see signs that the U.S., or some parts of the U.S. are on the right track for this. I very much hope so anyway. And that would be very encouraging. I'm not sure. I do miss not being involved. Well, the wine I was going to bring, but thank you for opening this, was a Pinot Noir I made. It was the 2010. And that to me was, you talk about the good life, that was a good life. I had 5 years of making that wine. Did all the viticulture work myself, except for one spray operation. And that to me was a good life, because it was very direct, very honest, very consequential. All I did was go out and work. And it was limited. I mean, it was a very small project. Makes me admire, people that undertake larger things like that. It's a lot of work. It's a huge amount of work, but it's so satisfying. I don't know. I'm still trying to puzzle that out. I used to be very involved in music. I don't think I'll get involved the same way, but maybe there's something there. I'm spending my time, like probably most people now, landscaping and painting.
Yeah. What do you like to paint, Bob?
Oh, I'm painting walls.
Oh, I'm like acrylic or oil.
No, this is not acrylic or oil. And it's bathroom walls. I mean, just the walls that have needed painting for 15 years and that haven't been painted.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you said to yourself, or a little earlier, this too shall pass. I'm painting a wall going, this too shall pass. I will get through this wall.
Yeah.
It will not take me down. And things like that. But I don't know. My mother was a great gardener, and her mind would be blown by the amount of gardening I do now. But that's I think other people say, and baking. I like baking.
Yep.
I'm eating too many. I nearly brought you some cookies, but so I don't know. It's not quite lunchtime.
It's probably best I pass.
Yeah, I know. But I'm not sure. I really don't know. I'm open. I'm open to all sorts of stuff, and I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And but again, I'm privileged. I can sort of sit back a little bit, and yes, I'm still trying to earn a living, but it's not in a desperate way. So I can afford the time to, just read a book.
Yep.
Read a book, listen to some music.
Well, I think that is a good place.
Drink some wine with friends.
Drink some wine. It's a good place to have come in life. I really appreciate you being on the show, Bob.
Thank you for asking me. It's been fun.
It has. This has been Bob Madill. He understands that we need to recognize the good things in our life. He practices gratitude and responsibility, and he's still on life's journey. I hope you enjoyed this show. This has been Viticulture, where we share ways to cultivate a good life. Don't forget to visit our website at viticulturepodcast.com. Subscribe to our Substack, where you'll get show notes, transcripts, musings, and exclusive offers. And check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again for stopping by.